All right. Today we're going to be talking about legislative oversight, and that is Congress's ability through their committee system to oversee government agencies, which we call the bureaucracy. So if you imagine, say, Congress, the House, is 435 members, very little of that is done with all 435 members. What ends up happening is there are committees. They break out into committees, and in committees, most of the work is done. And there's a committee, we call these standing committees, for basically everything. Every government agency has a committee kind of linked to it. So, for example, the military, the Department of Defense is the federal agency that works for the president. Both Congress and the Senate have some version of a defense committee. That's called the Armed Services Committee. We have the Secretary of Education. There's a committee on education. We have committees on justice and whatever. If it's a federal agency, the CIA. Well, the CIA is a little bit different story. Although there is a Congressional Intelligence Committee, House Intelligence and Senate Intelligence Committees. The Department of State, the House and Senate have Foreign Relations Committees. Anyway, in these committees, they do a lot of things, a lot of work. First of all, what's important to know is if the House is 435 and the Senate is 100, right? The majority party in each chamber also has the advantage of having majority in each and every committee. So in the House, right now, the Democrats have the majority, meaning they have the majority in every committee, meaning that every committee hearing is run, the chairperson of that committee is a Democrat, and that every vote that takes place in committee of any significant committee has a Democratic advantage. There's Democrat majority in each committee. The Senate is Republican, so the Senate committees are all majority Republican, chaired by a Republican. We saw that when it came to the confirmation of, most recently, Brett Kavanaugh, where the Judicial Committee, which is the committee that oversees presidential Supreme Court appointments, was chaired by a Republican, and the committee itself had a majority of Republicans. The loudest people in that committee, in that particular committee hearing, were Democrats, with the exception of Lindsey Graham, but the majority is Republican. So that's kind of how the committee structure works. And bills need to pass through committees just like they need to, so if there's an education bill, it needs to pass through the education committee before it goes to the House. And that's important because the education committee could modify it, bottle it, whatever. But today we're talking about legislative oversight. So what they have the power to do, first of all, is to any legislation having to do with a federal agency. Let's say the Environmental Protection Agency. So there's a House Environmental Committee and the Senate. The Senate's committee is Science, Technology, and the Environment. I forget what the House committee's name is. But let's say it's the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a federal agency. So we'll say EPA committee. We'll just call it the EPA committee. And they oversee the environment more than just the EPA, but the EPA falls under their oversight. Any legislation, any budget, any money going to the EPA would basically have to go through that committee. They'd have to look it over. Additionally, every action that the EPA takes, the House committee is supposed to be looped in on and informed of, and they, like I said, conduct oversight. If the House doesn't like what the EPA is doing, they can hold a hearing. Now, a hearing is very important because hearings are like little trials, okay? They carry all the weight of a trial and all the features. People are subpoenaed, which means a subpoena is a court order to force someone to show up. You could subpoena a thing or you could subpoena a person. If I'm subpoenaed before the Education Committee, I've got to show up. If my laptop is subpoenaed, it's got to be delivered, that kind of thing. The members of the committee act as jurors. They're basically a panel, And anyone who testifies in a committee hearing is under oath, meaning if they lie, it's perjury and they can go to jail. So what ends up happening is whenever a congressional committee doesn't like what the federal government's doing, they hold a hearing. And whoever gets subpoenaed, it's usually the chair of the committee, whoever, among other people. Like the most recent set of hearings was the impeachment hearings, and there was the House, there was an intelligence committee, and then the ethics committee, I think, also got involved. But the hearings that took place, all of the federal employees that were kind of involved in the phone call with Ukraine or whatever were subpoenaed. Some didn't show up and they got away with it, and that's for another date. But a lot of people were subpoenaed, and what ended up happening was they had to testify under oath. And the panel can ask whatever questions they want. And that's a really uncomfortable position for someone to be in. So if the EPA, going back to the EPA, if the EPA wants its life to be easy, it listens to the Environment Committee of Congress. It takes into consideration what they're saying. Because if they make them angry, if the EPA makes the committee angry, they're going to get subpoenaed. And the chief of the EPA, the head of the EPA, any employees in the Environmental Protection Agency that are relevant might get subpoenaed, and they're going to get asked a ton of questions. And at that point, it's not about whether what they did was right or wrong. It's about whether or not the panelists can catch them in a lie. And they're going to ask them a bunch of questions that have hard answers and make them look bad on TV and in front of the panel, and or force them to lie and catch them in that lie. It's a really bad position to be in. So why legislative oversight is so important is because if Congress doesn't like something that the federal government is doing, they can hold a hearing. And if they hold a hearing, somebody could go to jail. And even if not, they could force laws to change because people don't want to go and sit in these hearings. It is so destructive. When Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she spent tens of hours in committee under oath, answering questions about all kinds of things, including her email, whatever. They just badgered her. They just beat her up in committee on television. And the things she said are then public record, and they can later go back and use that. Bill Clinton, what he did was he was subpoenaed before the House Ethics Committee, and they asked him, did you, have sex with Monica Lewinsky? And he said no. And at that point, that was a lie, and that's perjury. That's an impeachable offense. Potentially, the fact that he had sex with Monica Lewinsky is gross and is inappropriate and all those other things, but it is not an impeachable offense. So if he would have just said, yes, I did, and then, described it, we all would have been grossed out, but he probably wouldn't have been impeached. When he said, I did not have sex with that woman, when he said that, that was perjury, and which is lying under oath, and that was the impeachable offense, for example. So that's kind of the power of legislative oversight. It's really important, the ability to hold hearings and to oversee the bureaucracy. When we talk about the bureaucracy, we will then connect all three legs of the iron triangle. We've already done two now, the interest groups and the congressional committees. The third would be bureaucratic agencies, and then we'll be done with that. All right.